Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, I'm in one of the greenhouses today because I'm going to take a look at the tomatoes. Now, this year we've got about 16 varieties of tomato. Some of them I've grafted myself and the others are just ordinary plants. They're all doing pretty well actually, despite a really rubbish start to the year. I am absolutely delighted with the crop and with the quality of the tomatoes this year. Now, amongst those 16, there are 10 varieties that are Italian, including some that we've never grown before. Now, I thought it might be interesting to have a little bit of a review of these 10 Italian varieties. And actually, a week or so ago, I shot the footage for a taste test. I thought that might be informative. It turned out to be the most useless taste test in the history of taste tests. It was just me munching my way through a pile of tomatoes and declaring each and every one of them to be quite delicious. So really not very helpful, but amongst these 10 Italian varieties, there's not one of them that I couldn't really recommend. Now there are some that I think are performing a little bit better. We've got some with really very large fruit. We've got some that are particularly productive overall. And there are a couple, I think, that have perhaps the edge on flavour, or at least this year. The flavour of your tomato, of course, is affected by the weather conditions, and perhaps under slightly different conditions, the others might perform slightly differently. But we've eaten our way through enough of these fruits now that I'm fairly confident in our assessment, at least, of these tomatoes. And of course, when talking about the flavour of a tomato, it's entirely subjective. It depends on what one is looking for. So I've grown tomatoes from all over the place, but for some reason I keep coming back to Italian varieties, and I'm really very fond of them. I think there are probably two reasons for that. Amongst the European countries, I think Italy was the one that embraced the tomato most enthusiastically when it first arrived. Spain also, I think, but perhaps to a lesser extent. So tomatoes are just such an important part of Italian cuisine, and they've been given perhaps a little bit more attention there than they have in some other countries, including Britain, where tomatoes were initially treated with a great deal of suspicion. Another interesting factor is that Italy is so regional in terms of its cuisine and the varieties, and that regionality makes it very interesting because you can explore particular varieties of tomato or indeed other fruit and veg from all over the country, and they've each got their particular characteristics, and I really enjoy that. I love growing something with a bit of history or something that's tied to a particular region or cuisine. It makes it, for me, a little bit more interesting. So anyway, to the tomatoes. Well, I've got 3 small fruited varieties and 7 large, so perhaps it'll be sensible to start with the 3 small sorts. So the first one here is Principe Borghese. Now these fruits are larger than a cherry tomato, but smaller than a plum sort, and I think if anything this is perhaps the smallest of the 3 varieties I'm looking at here. On the neighbouring plant, if anything, perhaps this truss has slightly larger fruits. These are good quality fruits. It's a reliable cropper. In our experience, this is one we've grown for quite some time. And this is supposedly a common variety for sun-dried tomatoes. I've never tried that, but they do roast in the oven beautifully. Now the plants themselves tend to be fairly healthy in our experience, but they have a really compact growth habit. So these leaves come out from the stem and they bend sharply down, and that means they don't take up too much space. But on the other hand, this compact habit here leads to quite crowded foliage, and I'm not so keen on that. I would much rather have a more open habit where these leaves were more inclined to hold themselves up better and promote better airflow through the plant. We haven't had much trouble with them. As I say, they've been fairly healthy, but even so, that is perhaps a small point against this particular variety. Here's the remains of one of the trusses of Corbarino. This is a slightly larger tomato, and this has quite a nice growth habit. It's a lot more open than Principe Borghese. I've got another truss of fruit ripening in the background here, and the fruits again are really very good quality. I think the trusses are perhaps a little bit smaller, but the individual fruits slightly larger. The flavour is very similar, very little to pick between the two plants in terms of flavour, and I think not much to pick between them in terms of health. I prefer the open habit of Corbarino, but the Principe Borghese are certainly as healthy as these plants this year. So next we have Piennolo, and these are quite similar in size to Corbarino. If anything, these could be slightly larger on this truss. The plants have these really huge leaves, not so many of them, but they are really massive and a really nice open habit. I do like this plant a lot. Of the three, if anything, I think this one could be my favourite. This sort of old potato leaf variety. I mean, these leaves are quite curled here, but that isn't really a problem. These fruits are wonderful, and it's got quite a distinctive shape. There's a prominent point on the bottom of each one of these fruits. In terms of flavour, I think, if anything, Piennolo del Vesuvio might have the edge. At least this year, and grown in our greenhouses here, and according to my own taste buds. So that's all a little bit subjective. This is by no means scientific. I also like the growth habit of the plant, and I think if I could only grow one of these three smaller sorts, it would probably be Piennolo. The other two, though, they are certainly worthy of cultivation, and I would be quite happy to grow any one of them, or indeed all three of them again. So now on to the larger fruited sorts, and I've got 7 here, and I think there are 2 that are winning on fruit size, if that's of interest. There are 2 I think that have the edge on flavour, and there are 3 that I have found particularly productive. So I think what I'll do is start with those that I'm least bothered about. I think they're all great tomatoes, they all taste pretty good, and they're growing reasonably well, but I'll start with those where I think the others might have performed a little bit better. What I have here is an example of an oxheart tomato. This is a fairly standard variety, and you can find something similar from Italy or France. There's a fairly small but quite typical specimen here. Has a little bit of green about the shoulders. That's part of the characteristic of the fruit. It's not a defect. This particular tomato is very meaty, and perhaps of all of these, this one could be the sweetest variety. Not too much acid in this one, not too much in the way of pips and pulp. So yeah, this is quite a good one for both the salad and for cooking. Now this variety is simply called red pear, and there are tomatoes like this from all over Italy. This particular one is a selection from Frankie seeds, and well, it's a very nice tomato, no doubt about it. We've got some fairly good trusses of fruit on these, quite variable in size. Some of these are really quite large. These are just beginning to colour up now. This is a pretty good size specimen. It's cropping quite well. This is not a bad tomato by any means. I think there are one or two that I might prefer, but certainly this has performed pretty well for us this year. This is another tomato of, well, fairly similar nature. This is from Albenga, that's in Liguria in northern Italy. The red pear comes from Lombardy, so not too far removed. And yeah, I mean, this is giving some pretty good crops on the grafted plant, but rather less so on the ungrafted specimen. The fruits are quite nice, they're good quality. I think perhaps there are others amongst this collection that have the edge on flavour and slightly better productivity. On the grafted plant, we do have some pretty good trusses of fruit here, so I'm certainly not complaining about it. As I said at the start, every one of these tomatoes is really pretty good. So that's three of the larger fruited sorts that, well, if I was forced to rank these, I might be tempted to put those down the bottom. But this is where my taste test video went completely astray, because these still taste really good. I mean, there are no bad tomatoes in this mix. So in order to separate them, I'd have to start getting pretty fussy. So now to the two varieties that have produced the largest fruits. Now, size, of course, doesn't really matter unless you particularly want large fruits for some culinary purpose. Maybe you want to stuff them, or you particularly like them for slicing. But there are two here that produce really whopping fruits. One of them this year has produced a fruit over 800 grams, and that's pretty big for a tomato. So there is, though, I think, a bit of a correlation between size and flavour. And of course you can get really great small tomatoes and you can get quite rubbish large ones. But my experience so far has certainly been that the larger fruits tend to have the better flavours. And that is certainly something that I've observed here this year. So the winner in the size department is this one. This is Rosa di Sorrento. Now, not all of the fruits are enormous, but this is the variety that produced the largest fruit for me. These are really not far from ripe. As the name suggests, it is a pink skin sort. And I think one thing that's important, and this might be my top tip for tomatoes, is that when you're looking at large fruited sorts like this, it would be a mistake, I think, to allow them to fully colour up on the outside. Tomatoes ripen from the inside out, and if you wait until there's a deep red, or in this case a deep and consistent pink colour to the outside, and if you're trying to wait for these small patches of green to colour up, then the inside of the tomato has often gone a little bit too far and the texture can become a little bit mealy. It's far better, in my view, to pick these large varieties when they look just a little bit under on the outside. And then when you cut through, you find that the interior of the tomato is absolutely perfect. And this specimen, it's still quite firm, but I'm quite confident that if I pick this and cut through, that's going to be absolutely delicious. I do have some larger fruits on here that are yet to ripen, and we've got a bit of a whopper again up the top. Now this one was from a fused flower and it's going to produce a pretty ugly specimen, but it should still taste really rather good. The other winner in the size department is a tomato from Belmonte in Calabria. Now that is one of my favourites from this year's selection. And there are a couple of tomatoes from Belmonte. This is the so-called Costoluto, which means ribbed. I think it may be that the average size of the Belmonte tomatoes is at least as big as those from Sorrento, even though Sorrento has produced one or two specimens that are the largest from this year's crop. I mean, this is going to be a really weighty tomato. That hasn't started ripening yet, but over here we've got some that have, and again, I think this tomato is probably about ready. And this green on the shoulders here, that should not be considered by any means a defect. It's part of the character of these sorts of tomatoes. And again, I don't want to let this one colour up until it's a really strong red on the outside, because I think the inside would be a little bit over at that stage. I wouldn't be surprised if I cut this open, I found that this was in perfect condition inside. So I've covered the three that, if forced to do so, I would put at the bottom of the list. And then these two largest sorts, Rosa di Sorrento and Belmonte. Now, there are three varieties that have performed really well in terms of the overall yield. Now, I'm not doing a scientific comparison of the yield of these plants, so this is just an informal view based on what I've been harvesting so far and what I can see remaining on the plants. Now, one of those is Belmonte, so it's produced some of the largest fruits, but also a very great many of them. It's cropping really well. Now, I'll show you the other two. This variety is Pantano. This comes from Rome, and well, I've already taken some tomatoes from this truss, but you can see it's quite a large collection of fruit. They're a really good size again, and this one is very tasty. It's an interesting tomato. It's got a little bit more acid to it than some of the others. Now, personally, I'm not that keen on a tomato that is just sugary. I want a more balanced flavour, and this does make for very good eating, and it is also quite prolific. I've been very happy with the quantity and the quality of fruits that come from this one. Now, I would say that these are pretty ripe specimens because there's only a touch of green left on the shoulders here, but a bit of green is particularly common with this variety. I can see some of these have ripened quite consistently, but that's perhaps less typical than this one here. And I think this one is just about perfect. The third of the winners in the productivity category would be Canestrino di Lucca. This is a very nice tomato. Doesn't have too much in the way of pips and pulp in there, and in fact, if I were to cut this open, some of the seed cavity is actually hollow in this. This makes it, I think, a pretty good cooking tomato, and it's also very nice in the salad too. We've had trusses with plenty of fruits, and fruits of a pretty good size. That one hiding at the back is quite a large specimen. We've got a beauty down the bottom here. They don't ripen to a deep red, but well, they are fairly consistent in their ripening. This is quite a good performing variety. On the neighbouring plant, you can see that we've still got plenty of fruit to come. Now, I'm hoping that the weather will hold on long enough to allow us to ripen all of this fruit, because there is quite a lot of it. So Belmonte and Rosa di Sorrento, they produce the largest fruits. Pantano, Canestrino di Lucca and Belmonte, I think they've provided the largest yield overall. But the most important factor, of course, it's got to be flavour. And as I mentioned at the beginning, all of these are great tasting tomatoes. So there's certainly nothing here that I wouldn't be happy to grow again. I must confess though that two of these I think have the edge on flavour, and it's Belmonte and Rosa di Sorrento. I'm not entirely surprised by that, because I think those larger fruits often do have the finest flavours. So just to finish off, I'm going to pick some examples from what I think are my three favourites from this selection. That'll be from the small fruited sorts, Piennolo del Vesuvio, and then a Rosa di Sorrento and a Belmonte Costoluto. And I'll cut those open, show you what they're like inside, and have a little taste. Right, I am armed and dangerous, and it's time to taste a few of these tomatoes. So here I've got the Piennolo del Vesuvio. I will cut this both ways so you can have a little look at the inside. So it's not bad actually. I mean, these small ones, they can be all seed and no flesh, but this has a pretty good balance of seed and flesh. This is quite meaty, this is quite a thick wall on it, and yeah, these have roasted really well. They cook down beautifully and they become really very rich and delicious. And let's have a look now at Belmonte. So actually the bigger specimen of these is the Belmonte. I'm going to cut this straight through the middle. Well, I'll give you a close-up of this in a minute, but as you can see, there's very little seed here, very small seed cavities. Most of this is meat, and that is great. So I'll take a slice through there. Yeah, and again, it's quite consistent throughout the whole of the tomato. This is all flesh. And Rosa di Sorrento. Not much difference there, very small cavities. Yeah, let's have a look. Very similar, I would say. Not much between the two of those. So now just a close-up on those. This is the Piennolo del Vesuvio. It is a lovely looking little tomato. This is Belmonte, and you might just be able to make out that the centre of the tomato here is rather deeper red colour than the outside, and that's that bit I mentioned about these ripening from the inside out. And Rosa di Sorrento there. Not much between them in terms of the ratio of flesh to seed. Now I must say that I do like to taste my tomatoes with just a little pinch of sea salt. It makes all the difference to the flavour. Don't need much, but just that little pinch really brings out the sweetness and flavour of the tomato. It's nice, it's juicy, it's quite meaty because of these thick walls. It's very well flavoured for a small tomato. I'm very happy with that variety. The other two small ones, there's very little between them on the flavour, so any one of those would do pretty well, but I rather like the growth habit of this particular sort. Yeah, for a small tomato, pretty good. So this one is Belmonte. It's an entirely different beast. I think this is a great small fruited sort. The fruit is a handy size. It's obviously a lot bigger than a cherry tomato. But as soon as you move up to these big fellas, it's a different league, and these are so succulent and juicy, and the flavour is superb, rich and delicious. That's a really great tomato. And if this one is ripe, yeah, I think it really is ripe. This one should be really great too. And that's interesting actually, because I have a fancy on this tasting that the Belmonte is coming out on top. Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about it. With these two specimens here, this Belmonte is the superior tomato. I can't account for that in terms of ripeness, because I'm sure this tomato is ripe. I mean, this is a pink-skinned sort, as the name suggests, whereas this one ought to be a deeper red colour. They're actually pretty much the same. I can't imagine that there's any way that this is in any way an underripe representative of Rosa di Sorrento. The last time I compared these tomatoes, Rosa di Sorrento came out on top, not by much, but a little bit. But I must say today, this example of Belmonte, it's absolutely delicious. Really, if you're keen on tomatoes, there's a fantastic world of flavour out there to explore, and it's a little bit unfortunate that the mainstream seed merchants have a fairly limited catalogue of tomato varieties, and there are very few of the traditional and regional sorts readily available. But they are so well worth seeking out, partly because it's just interesting to grow something that has a long history or comes from a particular region where it's highly prized, but also because they are absolutely fantastic tomatoes. These are, despite the horrific conditions we've had this year with the weather, these are some of the best tomatoes I've ever grown. So I am pretty pleased with these. I'll leave a list of the varieties in the video description, but that is all for this video. So thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now. Fantastic.